On the 28th of January, 1547, inside the Palace of Whitehall in London, Henry VIII died. This was the end of one of the most brutal and horrific kings England had ever had ruling over it, and he was surrounded in his final moments with quiet, which was very different to the chaos and bloodshed that occurred during his time ruling over Tudor England. Henry VIII would be the man who would execute 2 of his own wives, and he would even cross some of his closest friends, dispatching them at the executioner's block on Tower Hill. But Henry VIII, despite his ferocity, had been ill and a shadow of his former self for some time, and he was a man who would grow huge due to obesity and overeating, and also problems caused by mobility issues. He would during his lifetime be afflicted with the deadly smallpox, and he also had gout, but these conditions would lead to his death. Henry, as mentioned, when he passed was quiet and calm, and he would at some point acknowledge his sins and realise that these could have prevented him from getting into heaven, where he believed he would be a king again. But following Henry VIII's death, there was a significant amount of panic and chaos. The king's wishes for his burial and tomb would never be adhered to, and he still, 500 years on, is buried in the same plain vault, in a chapel away from the resting place where he wanted to be laid to rest. But the tomb and vault of King Henry VIII would be broken into a number of times. But what is the story of this? Following the death of King Henry VIII, the plans were drawn up to inter and bury the king in the same place as his third wife, Jane Seymour. Jane had given the king everything he wanted in the form of his heir and successor, King Edward VI, but Jane had died following giving birth to their heir and son. The king then arranged for Jane to be buried inside a St. George's Chapel in Windsor Castle, and she was buried under the choir in the chapel in a vault. Henry wanted to be buried with his third wife, but the vault in the chapel would only, hopefully, be a temporary burial site, as the king had ordered plans for this huge, elaborate tomb to be finished, to bury him and Jane Seymour in, and presumably this would have been placed inside of Westminster Abbey, inside the Lady Chapel, close to the burial tomb of his mother and father, Elizabeth of York, and Henry VII. After the king's death, inside of his quarters, the servants were not aware what had happened, and they had made arrangements for food to keep being brought into his room. The royal doctors and physicians then prepared the king's body, and it was washed and then embalmed with many different spices, and it would then be placed in a lead-lined coffin, which was what the royalty would do. This coffin was very heavy, but the entrails and heart of King Henry VIII may have been buried elsewhere, which was a tradition at the time, for the body to be buried away from the heart. But the coffin of the king then lay in state inside of the presence chamber of Whitehall Palace, and it was then surrounded by burning tapers for many days, before the journey then began to take it to Windsor Castle, and specifically St. George's Chapel. The procession saw the coffin being taken from central London to Windsor, and this was a huge spectacle, and the procession was over 4 miles long, with the hearse carrying the coffin being pulled by horses wearing black, and on top of the coffin was an effigy of the king. For many people who saw this procession, this was the first time they'd seen an image of their king, as the effigy was covered in jewels and rich clothing. When the procession arrived at Sion Abbey, it rested for the evening, and there is a rumour here that the king's body may have exploded inside of the coffin, due to the gases building up. Following the evening rest, the procession finally arrived in Windsor, and the coffin would be carried into St. George's Chapel by 16 yeomen of the guard, showing how heavy this was, and it was carefully taken into the church for the funeral service. The coffin would then be placed above the site where it would be placed into the vault, and the funeral eulogy was performed by the Bishop of Winchester, Stephen Gardiner, as it was lowered into the vault. This vault was empty, except for the remains and body of Jane Seymour, Henry's third wife. Witnessing the funeral was Henry's sixth and final wife, Catherine Parr, and the servants and officers of the household, once the coffin had been lowered into the vault, snapped their ceremonial staves of office and threw these into the vault, symbolising that their duty to care over the king was now over. But as mentioned, this was only hopefully believed to be a temporary burial site for the most notorious King of England. The king had planned to make an elaborate tomb, and this would have been huge and massive, and would have been inside of Westminster Abbey. Meaning, if this would have been made, he would have had to have been exhumed and moved back to central London, following years of being buried in Windsor. The plans for this tomb would have been colossal, and it would have been incredibly lavish and expensive, but this was never completed, despite Henry VIII's wishes, and lots of different parts of it would then be sold off for wealth. Henry VIII's children would not finish this, and because of this, Henry VIII still lays in the same place where he was originally buried, inside of the chapel. But this is not an elaborate tomb, and today only a simple marble slab marks the burial place that says, "In a vault, beneath this marble slab, are deposited the remains of Jane Seymour, Queen of King Henry VIII, 1537, King Henry VIII, 1547, King Charles I, 1648, and an infant child of Queen Anne." The memorial was placed here by command of King William IV in 1837. But scattered around the same area are huge effigies of other kings and queens of England who are buried in the chapel, and these were not as notorious and formidable as Henry VIII. However, what is interesting is that many times throughout the centuries, the tomb of Henry VIII and the vault has been broken into. This was for a number of different reasons, and at one point his coffin was even lost. It wasn't until 1649 that the coffin of Henry VIII was disturbed for the first time, and he had been laid to rest for over a century. But when Charles I, the Stuart monarch who lost the English Civil War, would lose his head being executed following his trial, and he was then buried in the same vault as Henry VIII. This decision was made for a number of reasons, as Parliament needed to inter the executed king in a quiet place where royalists would not be able to get hold of his body and steal it, but St George's Chapel was chosen for this. They did not want to place him in the royal vault, and with this the vault containing Henry VIII was seen as a quieter and less accessible place for Charles I. This would also, it's hoped, dissuade possible supporters of Charles I digging him up. But when Charles's coffin was placed inside of the vault, it's believed that Henry VIII's coffin may have been damaged. The vault of Henry VIII now had inside it a king who was executed and disgraced. This was not good luck, but there was another burial that occurred inside of the vault. During the reign of Queen Anne, the final Stuart monarch, one of her children, died and was buried in the same vault in a small coffin. But following this, the coffin of Henry VIII was seemingly lost to time, and there was nothing marking the exact site of his burial. But it would be broken into again, as excavation occurred in 1813 inside of the chapel to make a passage for priests to access the new royal vault which had been made. The old vault containing Henry VIII and Charles I was broken into, and this was witnessed by Regent George, the Prince of Wales, and the future King George IV and other officials. In the vault they found a number of relics of King Charles I, which were removed, and then a watercolour painting was made of the vault. But when these people had broken into the vault, they noticed that Henry's coffin had been broken into a number of different ways, and it was noticed that the wooden shell had fractured and broken. The trestle which had been supporting it may have collapsed, and this could have happened when Charles's body was placed in the vault. But also it could have collapsed from the pressure created within Henry's body. But the coffin had allegedly split open. Following the work being completed, the vault was then sealed, and the marble slab mentioned earlier was placed on top of it. Henry VIII is one of the most brutal and barbaric kings of England, but he would be buried still 500 years on in a vault that he did not wish to be placed in. He planned for a huge, elaborate tomb to be made for him, showing how important he was in English history, but this would never take place, and he still today lies under a simple slab, unlike the other Tudor monarchs. But his vault would be broken into, and it has to be possibly the most infamous burial vault in history, as next to King Henry VIII, is the remains of the executed king, Charles I. Thank you for watching, and to support, please subscribe to Her Remarkable History